Welcome to the New Rochelle Public Library and this wonderful lecture we're having today. Just so you know, we have things all week, all weekend, so please take a look at the flyers out on the table. If you're not receiving our newsletters, if you'll give us your email address so we can send them to you, we have concerts, we have lectures, we have multiple film series going on. A little bit of everything and stuff for children as well, so tons of stuff for children. Art classes, you name it, we have it. So please just sign up and we will send you only once a week. We will not bombard you, but we'd love you to come to our events. I'm going to introduce now David Rose, who is going to introduce this lecture. David Rose is archivist of the New Rochelle Public Library, in charge of preserving our archival collections of original documents, personal papers, and photography related to the history of New Rochelle. For many years, David worked as archivist at the New York Botanical Garden and the March of Dimes. He's also a writer, author of the book Friends and Partners, The Legacy of Franklin D. Roosevelt and Basil O'Connor in the History of Polio. He is an amateur mycologist, which is the study of mushrooms, and contributing editor of the journal Fungi. His column Notes from Underground in Fungi explores the history of mycological science and the biographies of mycologists. Today, David will present on the biography of the New Rochelle artist Elizabeth Huntington Coley Fox. David.
Thank you, Toby. And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the New Rochelle Public Library. My talk today is going to be from a prepared text, and I'm glad to see you all here. And after the presentation, of course, we have the exhibit of 3 generations of artists, including Elizabeth Huntington Coley Fox outside. So linger over that. My talk on Elizabeth Huntington Coley Fox is subtitled Sparks of Beauty, Shards of God. I will refer to her as Elizabeth throughout. Elizabeth experienced sparks of beauty everywhere, every day, which she presented visually in her painting. Thus, bits or traces or shards of God appear everywhere, nourishing the individual by imparting a sense of the sacred. She expressed this quite poetically and philosophically. She said, quote, "If you can see and express beauty, it means that you realize or perceive the spark of God in everything. And if you perceive it, you make it part of your own experience. And thus, bits of God add beauty to your own individuality. The individual spark of beauty, which is God in you, the part that lives, is the self, the you yourself. You make your spark vital by giving it off. You make your knowledge vital by giving it off. God makes himself vital by giving off sparks of himself. That's why giving is a principle of existence." Images and memories flow through us as they flow through time. Our attempt to hold them close often depends on a record of letters and photographs when memory becomes attenuated and fails us. This antique photograph depicts an ordinary family, the Coley family of Utica, New York. The philosopher Gilbert Chesterton stated that, quote, "The most extraordinary thing in the world is an ordinary man and an ordinary woman with their ordinary children," end of quote. This is the sense in which the Coleys were ordinary. That is to say, they were an extraordinary family. Here is the Reverend Edward Huntington Coley, rector of Calvary Church in Utica, New York, and his wife, Julia Seeley Covell. They had 3 daughters, Marjorie, Elizabeth, and Mary. And this photo dates from about 1899. As a father and minister, the Reverend Coley had a profound influence on his daughter, Elizabeth. They worshiped together, discussed church matters and theology with enthusiasm, and corresponded with each other their entire lives. These photos were taken in 1897 when Elizabeth was but 2 years old. This is Elizabeth at around age 30 in 1925, along with her self-portrait. Elizabeth Huntington Coley was born on January 13th, 1895, in Stamford, Connecticut. Her father, Reverend Edward Coley, became bishop of the Protestant Episcopal Church of Central New York in 1924. Elizabeth attended private schools in Utica, and during the years of World War I, she embarked on an art career. In 1917, she relocated to New York City to attend the Art Students League of New York, after which she became a teacher at the Utica Country Day School. She traveled across the continent in 1922 to see the Grand Canyon and the Canadian Rockies. And in 1924, she made the grand tour of Europe, visiting 8 European countries. Elizabeth married John Futhy Fox in 1928, and they lived on Storer Avenue in New Rochelle until 1947. Elizabeth was always proud to say that she was a life member of the Art Students League of New York, and she was also a devoted member of the New Rochelle Art Association, even after she relocated to Long Island. In 2021, Elizabeth's granddaughter, Susan Matrano, donated her grandmother's collection of personal papers to our library's archive. This outstanding collection, for which we are deeply grateful, documents the life of Elizabeth and her family in intricate and superabundant detail. These papers include the sermons of her father, the Reverend Coley, records of schools and churches, memorabilia of New Rochelle, along with diaries, journals, photography, artwork, and a collection of correspondence that is stupendous and revelatory, documenting not only the Coley and Fox families, but the changes in family life in American society through a tumultuous century of enormous change. I have estimated that the collection of correspondence alone numbers over 1,000 items, including personal letters, postcards, business correspondence, invitations, telegrams, and holiday greeting cards, especially at Christmas and Easter. We have not only the inbound correspondence to Elizabeth from her immediate family and a circle of relatives and friends, but very often the outbound correspondence of Elizabeth herself. She often made multiple copies of her own letters. She deliberately requested her parents, sisters, and husband to save her letters to them. She literally saved the record of her life in her letters, most preserved in their original envelopes from as early as 1906 to the year of her death in 1973. The family preserved the collection in boxes and bins, some in metal boxes like the one you see here, and often tied up with ribbon or string. This is my work area here at the library, with a mass of these letters in process. What you see here is probably about 25% of the entire collection. The archival enterprise of organizing the correspondence was daunting, interesting, sometimes perplexing, and always filled with discovery. The preservation of envelopes was important for accurate dating. There were round-robin letters, torn up and cut up letters, notations on envelopes, rewritten letters, several drafts of single letters, and copies sent to 2 or more recipients, which today that's really a modality of email, sending one item to many people. The entire correspondence is now organized and stored in 40 archival boxes. Fortunately, Elizabeth's handwriting was legible, while her mother's, for example, which you see here on the left, presented a bit of a challenge. In a letter to John Futhy Fox, Elizabeth wrote, quote, "Of course, if you don't much like letter writing yourself, you can't understand how a person could delight in sketching off these little notes and letters to a good friend. But I do so enjoy writing that to me, it's the greatest fun to do it. You really mustn't think that because I've done it for you, it's a favorable symptom." End of quote. Elizabeth was fond of 2 epistolary novels by Jean Webster, Daddy Longlegs, published in 1912, and Dear Enemy, published in 1915. These were very popular at the time, and they were models of epistolary romance. In a recent Penguin re-release of these books, Elaine Showalter, professor of English at Princeton, stated, "The epistolary format of these 2 novels allows the liveliness of women's letter writing to cloak the radical notions of women's limitless strength and capability." So it's no wonder that Elizabeth admired them so. Now, do we have the childhood drawings of Georgia O'Keeffe or Mary Cassatt or Louise Nevelson? I don't know the answer to that, but we have evidence of Elizabeth's early artistic inclinations with Elizabeth's Picture Book from 1900. In her childhood years, she was steeped in the classics, Greek and Roman mythology, history and literature, grammar, and Bible study in the religious household of her father, the Reverend Coley. But the secular attractions of New York City were formidable and fairly close by, so she relocated as a young adult to live on the Upper West Side to attend the Art Students League in 1917. At the Art Students League, Elizabeth took courses in illustration, life drawing, and advertising. The League was founded in 1875 as the first independent art school in the United States. In 1892, it relocated uptown from the Washington Square neighborhood to West 57th Street, where Elizabeth enrolled in classes. She led an active social life, expanding her network of artist friends whose dedication and talents were nurtured by the sophistication of classes at the League. She called on friends, attended church services, attended Liberty Bond mass meetings, it was during World War I, and enjoyed the theater. She kept up a steady stream of letters home to her parents. In April 1918, she wrote, quote, "I want to be an artist, the real thing eventually. But I realize that to be one must have years of study, not necessarily in an art school, but nevertheless real study. In the meantime, I absolutely refuse to sit down on the family and not earn anything if there is any possible good way to open for me to do it that would not interfere with my art study." End of quote. She made good on her promise by teaching at the Utica Country Day School and Greenwich Academy. All the while, she nurtured an alternative plan for forsaking art to become an Episcopal missionary. In the summer of 1919, Elizabeth visited Provincetown on Cape Cod. This was a mere 3 years after playwright Eugene O'Neill rose to great acclaim on the heels of the founding of the Provincetown Players, a collective of artists, writers, and theater enthusiasts. And so the ambience of the place was vibrant with artistic possibility. Elizabeth attended the West End School of Art to study under George Elmer Brown, whose artwork followed the Impressionist painters. The following year, in 1920, Brown wrote to Elizabeth inviting her to study with him in his new Manhattan studio in a course on how to make a sketch, how to make a finished painting from sketch. In Provincetown, Elizabeth established a friendship with the young Joseph Olaf Olson. Her slight flirtation with Olson was surpassed by serious study and a short correspondence until 1922. She praised and appreciated Olson for his instruction about color in nature. In one letter she wrote, quote, "I wonder if you noticed the moon last night. I came back from a dance with a young lieutenant, and he appreciated the moonlight to a certain extent, but he doesn't understand how it makes me feel, as you and Guy de Maupassant do." End of quote. At the Art Students League, Elizabeth studied under several well-known artists. Clockwise from the upper left are Thomas Fogarty, who is an illustrator and teacher of Norman Rockwell. Anne Goldthwaite, an American painter whose Parisian circle included Matisse, Picasso, and Gertrude Stein. Francis Louis Mora, a Uruguayan-born American painter whose students included Georgia O'Keeffe. George Bridgman, who taught figures drawing at the League for 45 years. Mahonry Young, a social realist sculptor. And Gutzon Borglum, best known for what? Do we know? Isn't Gutzon Borglum a household name? He was the sculptor of Mount Rushmore. Yes. In the summers of 1925 and 1926, Elizabeth studied sculpture at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts under Albert Lacely, best known as an animalier, an artist whose specialty is the realistic portrayal of animals. She exhibited her work at the Academy in 1926. The accompanying letter from Mr. Lacely, you see here, pertains to the preparation of a cast of her original work, as well as a critical review in the Parisian art journal, Le Revue Moderne. Le Revue Moderne published a short review of Elizabeth's work in 1926, giving her high praise. The journal reproduced images of her sculpture at the Pennsylvania Academy and an earlier painting of Provincetown Harbor. The Utica Daily Press reported, quote, Elizabeth Coley presented at the exhibition of the Pennsylvania Academy a charming sculpture of great truth of movement and life. Miss Coley is above all a painter and a professor for future artists whose innate artistic sense she educates from the age of 5 or 6, obtaining astonishing results. Elizabeth's religious education and artistic inclinations blended as her teaching methods evolved, beginning with her experience at Miss Knox's school in Utica, which became the Utica Country Day School. This photograph of her 2nd grade class is accompanied in her papers by an extended caption to illustrate what she called purposeful learning. She wrote, quote, at the left with his back to the window stands D. Wilton, bank cashier. Betty T. is drawing out money through the bank window. Next to them is Betsy Ann painting a picture in the studio. Behind her is a movable chart hanger. In the sandbox is a village of Philippine huts on stilts. Jack and John S. are on that committee. Jane is looking at the goldfish, and Mary Angela is fixing the file cards on the exhibition in the Natural History Museum. Elizabeth was 32 years old when she met John Futhy Fox in 1927. Futhy, as he was known to all, was born in 1888 in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. Futhy had graduated from the Webb Institute of Naval Architecture in Glen Cove, Long Island in 1910 and was employed as a marine engineer at the U.S. Navy Yard in Brooklyn thereafter. He was a specialist in the design of submarine diesel engines and the electrical and electronics phases of warship design. The 1920s were the early days of radio, and Futhy loved to build and repair radio sets for family and friends. Their courtship from 1927, September 27, to their marriage on June 23, 1928, is documented by hundreds of letters from Elizabeth in Utica and from Futhy in Brooklyn as they planned their wedding and moved to New Rochelle. Their courtship correspondence is beautifully expressive, one of the finer highlights of the Elizabeth Coley Fox papers. Futhy was accepted by the Coley family and visited Utica often, though Elizabeth was sometimes troubled by doubt and indecision. One interruption occurred in October 1927 when the Navy Yard dispatched Futhy to troubleshoot a mysterious engine vibration on the USS Leviathan that disrupted the dining room. The Leviathan was the largest ship in the world after the Titanic, formerly a German ship, the Vaterland. It had been repurposed after World War I as an American passenger ship. Futhy and a team of engineers analyzed and recommended repairs to the Leviathan in a transatlantic voyage to France. And so he and Elizabeth corresponded by steamer letters for a few weeks. This is a postcard view of the swimming pool inside the USS Leviathan. And this, a high society putting contest, reminds me of a fundraiser that we just did here at the library a couple weeks ago. Now take a close look at this envelope. The two 2-cent stamps in the upper right corner would have been sufficient for regular mail in 1927. But in this case, Futhy added 5 stamps, 10 cents, and bracketed these extra stamps with the words special delivery. Elizabeth and Futhy called this a special. I sent you a special, they would say. Did you receive my special? Elizabeth wrote to Futhy, quote, it's a habit I have, and I think a good one, to examine every important question as far as possible to its foundations on all sides, and then slowly come to a decision about it. That's the way I shop and the way I vote, and it seems to be the only way that satisfies me, end of quote. In her diary, she listed several incompatibilities with John. 3 of them were discussed at great length in their letters. The first was drinking alcohol. She was a strict prohibitionist. The second was her pacifism vis-a-vis Futhy's work at the Navy Yard, building military ships. And third, Futhy's confirmation in the Episcopalian faith. Now, the next passage that I read is rather lengthy, but it will show her thinking about all of these things. On October 28th, 1927, Elizabeth wrote, I don't mean to be one of those ranting, self-deceiving pacifists who go on the theory that there is no wickedness nor greed in the world, and therefore nothing to guard against. But John, I do believe in stretching one's mind to its furthest capacity to find out how great a vision one can see. And then, with that in the back of one's mind, look calmly at the facts and determine a sensible line of conduct. That was a fine piece of exposition, your letter. I've carried it around with me and read it many times. I've thought about it a great deal and talked this subject over with several people. If the idea of sacrifice on the cross seems so inexplicably foolish and weak and even wicked to Christ's own followers when they knew he had a power to save himself from it and go on in the old aggressive way, and yet his way has finally proved itself to be all-conquering because it is the way of self-sacrificing love instead of coercion. Is it utterly foolish then and wrong to think of a nation daring to conquer the world for the highest liberty by the same method of self-sacrificing love instead of mounting armaments of coercion? In Christ's time, the human race had not progressed far enough to comprehend the love, so they killed him, but still his love conquered. Could not a nation lead the way to a higher international code of outlawing war by simply scrapping its army and navy, leaving itself open to the scourgings and crucifixion of greedy nations, but in the end, though it might perish from the earth in this process, leading the way to a new trust between nations as there is between the states of our union? What nation could better run the risk than the United States? And it might not perish from the earth. The vision might win, but should not we anyway be sufficiently internationally minded to be willing to have our country die if need be in order to lead the world to a higher conception of peace? Is this not the highest possible outlook? While we should perhaps be willing to have the United States sacrifice even her national life on the cross of the way of love, a surer way to world peace would seem to be to preserve the vital flame of her national existence by adequate defense measures in order that she may have her full strength to work in every possible way to outlaw war and to have it looked down upon as antiquated and wasteful in the same way that dueling is now regarded. From this point of view, it wouldn't be inconsistent in the wife of a Navy Yard man to want to investigate all organizations to promote peace and to even join one and work for it if she could find the right one that seemed really progressive and not flighty, and to feel glad if a disarmament conference should succeed, even if it meant fewer material comforts, and to believe that children should be taught that the control of the mind, that control by the mind and spirit is far higher than the physical way of force, and that modern heroes are those of discovery and the laboratory rather than warriors. Do you suppose they could feel that way, John, while still being justly proud and deeply interested in his work for the Navy? End of quote. What a love letter. And these are only excerpts from a 20-page letter. There's more. In an earlier letter, she had written, quote, I can't let you think that I don't love my country, John. I love it so desperately that it makes my throat ache when I let myself think about it. I've had the wonderful chance of seeing it from the Atlantic to the Pacific, the wide grassy plains, sagebrush on the desert, the lifting up of the steep, steep mountains way over by the Pacific, and of knowing many classes of its people, from the Rockefellers in Greenwich to the patient, poorest ones in our parish, and those from different nations at international art classes. When I came back from Europe, awed as I had been by the ancient glories that have given us our background, my soul was all but out of me when I saw the Statue of Liberty and realized all that America meant to me. In the war, I was so ashamed and frantic to think that I wasn't considered strong enough to go over as a trained nurse, but could only buy Liberty bonds or knit, or make Red Cross bandages, and try to cook from the family on a very strict wheatless and sugarless diet. So I don't feel very proud of my war record. But I've always hoped I could, if the need should ever arise, to say with Nathan Hale, I regret that I have only one life to give for my country. I agree with you that one wants to stand up for one's country just as one would stand by one's family. But it seems to me that to think only of one's country's good and not of the highest good for all the nations of the world and for the human race is very much like the states' rights view of the Southerners who would have split the nation because they could not see that the highest good for all was to work together. I don't believe that the time has come for a United States of the world, but I can't see that our country would lose anything by being in such a group if it were the best way for the peace of the world and the advancement of the human race. You see, John, you really are calling my bluff in a good many ways and making me sift through my ideas to see if they are argument proof or not. I only wanted to make sure that my ideals did not conflict with my interest in naval affairs, which, strange to say, has always been very lively. End of quote. At the end of this long letter, Elizabeth copied out the 4 verses of America the Beautiful by Catherine Lee Bates for Pusey to read. Oh, beautiful for spacious skies and amber waves of grain. Pusey was confirmed in the Episcopal Church, relieving some of Elizabeth's angst about their marriage. With great sensitivity and understanding, she had earlier written, quote, "It makes me so happy to know that you are really thinking of confirmation, for I had made up my mind that I couldn't possibly marry you until you could share that part of my spiritual life with me. While I don't feel that a husband and wife should feel spiritually bound by one another, I have never been able to see how they could have that side of their life entirely apart. I thought of you Sunday when I heard a beautiful sermon about Thomas the Doubter. He said that love was the main thing in the world, and if a man truly loved our Lord and earnestly tried to live up to his best convictions to put into practice the gospel ideals, he was on the road to confirmation, even though he couldn't thoroughly understand all the doctrine and theology. John, dear, you were so wonderful to say that about trying to change in any way you could, conscientiously. I don't want you to feel any sense of coercion at all, but there are certain things that I could not be happy about. Your not being confirmed was one, and I do appreciate your thinking it over carefully. Even now, don't do it if you feel that you aren't quite ready." End of quote. Elizabeth and Pusey enjoyed a honeymoon at the Mohunk Mountain House in New Paltz, New York. At the end of summer, they moved to a house in New Rochelle that Pusey had helped to design. They lived first at 146 Storer Avenue and then 246 Storer from 1928 to 1947. Here, they raised a family and became active participants in the New Rochelle community. In 1947, they relocated to New Hyde Park in Long Island, but stayed in contact with their many New Rochelle friends all the while. John Pusey Fox Jr. was born in 1929, and the 2 new parents were thrilled to start a family. Their daughter, Anita Huntington Fox, was born April 10th, 1930, but tragedy struck as the infant Anita suddenly died 5 weeks later on May 17th. On that day, Elizabeth and Pusey noticed the infant's respiratory difficulties and rushed her to the hospital, but Anita succumbed from an enlarged thymus gland. Thymic enlargement in children was known at the time, but the shock of infant mortality sent the family into mourning as the flood of congratulatory letters turned to condolence letters with this heartbreaking turn of events. I am certain that Elizabeth prayed for the soul of Anita for the rest of her life. Yet the family recovered. This is the Fox family in New Rochelle, August 1931. In little more than 3 years, Edward Huntington Coley Fox would be born on January 18th. This photograph is a classic family portrait of the Coley, Fox, and Gates families. Standing at left are the Reverend Edward Coley and his wife, Julia. At far right are Futhy and Elizabeth, who is holding Edward. In the center standing are Elizabeth's two sisters, Marjorie Covell Coley Gates, the wife of Reverend Edmund Jane Gates. She's holding one of their 7 children, and Mary Coley stands next to Elizabeth. John Fox Jr. sits on the ground, second from right. In the 1930s, Elizabeth was preoccupied with raising a family, and she kept an annual diary through these years. America was faced with the calamity of the Great Depression, but surprisingly, she mentioned little about current events in her writing. She did attempt to seek employment and applied for a position as an advertising artist for the Campbell's Soup Company. She didn't get the job. Fortunately, Futhy continued to work full-time at the Navy Yard. She joined the New Rochelle Art Association, became acquainted with local artists, and eventually entered exhibits. In the pamphlet on the right, we see a stellar roster of speakers. John Sloan was one of the founders of the Ashcan School of American Art, and Walter Gropius was a German-American architect and founder of the Bauhaus School. These are but 2 of the most famous art and design personalities of the time. This is Trinity Episcopal Church, just around the corner on Huguenot Street, as it looked 100 years ago. Elizabeth was a devoted parishioner and educator at Trinity Church for most of the 2 decades that the Fox family lived in New Rochelle. She developed a friendship with the rector, Reverend Philip Stiles, and with Clinton and Lorraine Ellie, the organist and contralto of the church choir. She was a member of the Women's Auxiliary, and both her sons attended Sunday church school at Trinity. There are many documents related to Trinity Church in the Coley Fox papers, such as this Holy Week program and a floor plan appended to a short history of the church. Among the official records are Elizabeth's personal reflections and poetry. One short poem she titled War Weight. This is the poem. Jesus, who hung upon the cross and sins of all for all time bore, how heavy must have weighed on thee this war. Elizabeth maintained a correspondence with her friend Emmeline Bound, a missionary of the American Church Mission in China, who trained Chinese students in nursing through the auspices of the Episcopal Church for many years, even during World War II. In this case, her letter was returned during the wartime uncertainties of the mail. Elizabeth had a deep reserve of sympathy for humanity and remained involved in missionary work among Native American cultures through the Episcopal Church. She sponsored and promoted the educational outreach of William Jacobs, also known as Chief Crazy Bull, Tatanka Whitco, grandson of the Lakota Sioux leader Sitting Bull. Jacobs gave presentations on Sioux culture and history and on the church's missionary work in the Dakotas. Elizabeth wrote, quote, "In his talks to church groups, he is interesting and informative, a charming personality, and thoroughly conversant with the church's work among American Indians. He often addresses Episcopal church groups, telling of his own people and their customs and the work of the Episcopal Church in South Dakota. Nearly all of the Sioux are Episcopal Church members." End of quote. Jacobs often appealed to Elizabeth for warm coats and clothing that he shipped to the Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. With Elizabeth as a sponsor, Chief Crazy Bull gave a presentation at the Trinity Church in New Rochelle, as did Ella Deloria, the aunt of Vine Deloria, whose book, Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian Manifesto, was a milestone in Native American activism in the 1960s. Elizabeth was a member of the Mothers Club of New Rochelle and supported the Maternal Health Center, a precursor to Planned Parenthood. Here is an excerpt from the letter you see on the right from the Maternal Health Center. Quote, "We believe that all parents, no matter how poor or handicapped, should have the same privilege as the financially more fortunate of deciding the size and spacing of their families if they want to do so. The Maternal Health Center of New Rochelle has, since it opened in 1935, given safe contraceptive advice to over 600 underprivileged mothers. Some patients can pay nothing. The rest can only pay a very small fee. End of quote. Despite the many uncertainties of the time, the Fox family did what other families might do to enjoy a summer day, such as spending an afternoon sunbathing at Jones Beach. John Jr. and Edward attended schools in New Rochelle, including the Daniel Webster School, the Thornton Donovan School, and of course, Sunday School at Trinity Church. They attended summer camps and both became college graduates. This photograph presents an interesting study of the nature of the American roadside before the advent of the interstate highway system. Here we have the Reverend Coley, Elizabeth, and Edward enjoying a roadside lunch en route from New Rochelle to Utica in 1941. Now, let's turn to Elizabeth's artwork. Elizabeth wrote, quote, "The human mind is made in such a way that it keeps trying to understand its own experiences and express them. If you've had an exciting adventure, you tell about it, completing a cycle. God is a great personal cycle of vital beauty, keeping in existence by emitting sparks of himself, vital beauty or rightness, which he draws back toward himself through the evolutionary cycle completing force. Each of these sparks is a miniature personal cycle of vital beauty. The way you know the cycle is complete is the feeling of satisfaction inside." End of quote. I'm not sure how to interpret that statement, but we'll let that stand as it is. This is Elizabeth's description of her painting, If Winter Comes. On a winter Sunday afternoon, the young farmer and his wife have been planting their spring garden in New Rose Arbor. The grandfather's clock struck 4, and he jumped up to go out to the barn to milk the cows, while she left her knitting to get supper. He is looking back at the cozy room with thoughts of the garden and expected addition to the family in his mind. That is the description of that painting. If Winter Comes is a marvelous blend of nostalgia, domesticity, love of family with a striking saturation of color. Elizabeth wrote, quote, "Beauty is an intangible thing. Beauty stirs a pleasurable emotion in the person who is gazing on it. Then it is a subjective rather than an objective attribute. For one person, a thing is beautiful, that to another is quite the reverse. There is no absolute definition of beauty. Beauty must always be connected with something uplifting, not degrading. All beauty is not truth any more than truth is not always beautiful. An entirely untrue fantasy may be extremely beautiful. Beauty is an attribute of anything visible or invisible as a beautiful thought. It is not a steadfast attribute like truth. If a thing is true, it stays true. Truth itself is unchanging, though our points of view toward it may change." End of quote. Here, using the Socratic method of question and answer method, Elizabeth asked, quote, "Is there any part of the soul that is developed beyond other parts?" "Yes, the will." "To which parts then should we turn our attention in order to cultivate them and so rise to a higher plane of existence?" "The religious and the aesthetic." "What methods do we use in training the mind?" "A carefully planned course of study with constant drill and broadening of the mental horizon." "Does such a method seem adequate or at least helpful, securing satisfactory results in training of the mind? Then why not apply it to the training of the soul, especially the religious and aesthetic sides of it, in an art course? An art course should stimulate and cultivate the aesthetic sense and rouse an interest in art, past and present, show the range and endless possibility of mediums and subjects, and give definite technical and simple instruction in its many mediums as practical." On several occasions, Elizabeth's paintings were displayed at the New Rochelle Public Library, often in exhibits of the New Rochelle Art Association. This 1954 letter from the library reads, quote, "Dear Mrs. Fox, just a reminder to you that we still have your painting Ornament Fantasy and also the Christmas mural done by your young artists. While on display, they attracted much attention and favorable comment. We do appreciate your kindness in lending them to us. End of quote. Elizabeth wrote, "Art is the creation of something that satisfies the aesthetic sense of the human soul. A person must be stirred consciously or unconsciously before he can produce a work of art. The creative element must enter into it, a touch of the individual's personality. It must satisfy the aesthetic sense of the human soul." Here, Elizabeth's watercolor depiction of a Main Street scene at Christmas time shimmers with the excitement of holiday shopping at Ware's department store. Ware's was the first department store in Westchester County. It was later sold to Bloomingdale's. The building still stands, amazingly enough, just around the corner from the library. Another recognizable New Rochelle structure that Elizabeth painted is the Tom Paine Cottage, which seems here to bask in an autumnal glow. This painting has been donated to our library thanks to Susan Mitrano and the Friends of the New Rochelle Public Library. Elizabeth exhibited a painting using day-glow paint that was evaluated by 4 judges of the New Rochelle Art Association in 1955 and again in 1966, in keeping with this, which the day glow was in keeping with the spirit of the psychedelic 60s. She wrote, quote, "The urge for this painting came from the brilliancy of day glow colors and the problem of seeing whether the various tones, so jarring when in close juxtaposition, could be made to sparkle like jewels when used in rhythm and balance of shapes and spaces on a black background. Unfortunately, that painting has been lost." During the war years, Futhy and Elizabeth attended the commissioning and launching of several ships at the Navy Yard. In 1940, the USS North Carolina. In 1944, the USS Bennington and USS Missouri. And in 1945, the USS Kearsarge and the USS Franklin Roosevelt. The World War II years were extremely busy ones for Futhy as the Navy Yard launched ship after ship. In Elizabeth's papers are copies of the Navy Yard Shipworker, which is subtitled, "The Man Behind the Man Behind the Gun." Despite her strong feelings about disarmament and the terrible inhumanity of war, Elizabeth supported the Allied war effort against the Axis powers. In fact, she wrote a patriotic song, "Victory for Freedom," a copy of which she later sent to Clementine Churchill, wife of Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The war and the aftermath of war was filled with personal sadness and mourning, as Elizabeth's mother died in 1940 and her father in 1949. After retirement in 1950, Futhy died in 1951. Elizabeth believed that Futhy had been ground down, quote, "under the heel of insufferable military despots for most of his life," end of quote. Later, in 1960, her poem, "Eyes of the Mind," was printed in the annual poetry anthology of the National Poetry Association. The pathos in this poem is quite evident, and it's difficult not to avoid the notion that she wrote this remembering her husband of 23 years. Eyes of the Mind by Elizabeth Huntington Coley Fox. To walk along this street and not remember that you were here when last I walked this way would be impossible till love's last ember had died away. Often I think of you as close beside me, though you are far away. So sweet it is to dream I hear your voice and see you smiling and feel your kiss. Eyes of the mind have such precious magic, taught the great mystery by some wise elf. But after all, it is but emptiness. I want yourself. In the late 40s, probably at the instigation of John Jr., the family began to use these nicknames. Futhy was ginormous. Elizabeth was Hogan. John Jr. was Jag, and Edward was Egghead. John referred to his brother Edward as Egghead in teasing admiration of his intellect and talent. The boys referred to their father, a very tall man, as ginormous, slang used by British soldiers in World War II. Now, that's an interesting word. I thought that was maybe 10 or 20 years old, but it goes back farther than that. The family consistently used these nicknames in their correspondence. I have no clue as to the origin of the name for Elizabeth, but she accepted Hogan wholeheartedly, always signing her letters to her sons as Hogan for the rest of her life, an interesting and peculiar family mystery. Over time, Elizabeth had acquired several nicknames. Her friend Helen Baker called her Bet or Betsy. Her sister-in-law Millie used Lisbeth. As a young woman, she referred to herself as Libby, which then led to Libus and Libethus in correspondence. A niece called her Miss Wittywinks. Her cousin Otis called her Joe. And after marriage, she was Mrs. J.F. Fox. Now, this cartoon is a teenage parody of Edward's piano playing by his brother, John Jr., Jackie. The musical scores scattered about have these titles: The Woodpecker and Cat's Serenade, The Little Dumb Cluck, The Braying Donkey, and The Trumpeter's Lemonade. John Jr. joined the U.S. Navy in 1955, and after basic training was assigned to the USS Salem, a heavy cruiser that was dispatched to the Mediterranean during the Suez Crisis in 1956, which caused months of anxiety for the family, and especially for Elizabeth. On December 24th, 1955, as he entered basic training, John wrote, quote, "Dear Hogan, got a barrage of mail from you at mail call today, and it seems that I have not pounded it home sufficiently what a mess this is. I have no space to keep anything, and the company commander could not be bothered with such claptrap. He has developed into a somewhat sour individual. I haven't really time to write this. I have no place to keep Christmas cards. Please get the word around to everyone not to send any unnecessary bulk, and preferably just nothing. And don't forward things like Ellie's Christmas cards. I have no place, repeat, no place to keep anything more than a tiny trickle of nice, thin letters. Just tell me what mail comes in and let it pile up in my room. Consider me in prison." End of quote. Now, this may seem the lament of a desperate sailor, but John adapted to Navy life once on board the Salem, and he even smuggled aboard the ship a hi-fi audio system to play records, this with the tacit approval of the commanding officer. Though Elizabeth's sons, John and Edward, were educated at New Rochelle schools, they obviously benefited by their education at home. Their father, Ginormous, was a multi-talented engineer, and the two boys gravitated toward the burgeoning hobby of hi-fi sound recording. They were both audiophiles, but Edward took that interest to a much higher level, receiving a master's degree in electrical engineering at MIT. Edward joined the technical staff at RCA Laboratories in Princeton, researching magnetic recording in videotape, stereo disc, and optical disc. He developed Dynagroove stereo discs that improved bass and reduced audio distortion in stereo. His papers are preserved as the Edward C. Fox papers at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Meanwhile, John remained an audiophile, a classical music maven, and an expert photographer with his Leica camera. And what you see on the left is his photographs, which are like 1 inch by 2 inch photographs pasted on letters. There were about 30 of them. I only showed a few here. After Futhy's death, Elizabeth never remarried, but she remained close to her sisters and her 2 sons. Their correspondence is enormous. For income, she turned to tutoring assignments at the Washington Square Reading Center in Manhattan and the Cathedral School of St. Mary on Long Island. The latter became regular employment when she began to teach 2nd grade full-time in 1951. By the early 1960s, she was promoted to the head of the primary division at the school. She also turned toward creating art and exhibited here at the library. Among many incidental artworks, Elizabeth created book plates for William Bradley Coley, her father's cousin, and his son, Bradley Lancaster. William Coley was a medical doctor, a bone surgeon whose pioneering studies in the treatment of cancer by bacterial toxins advanced the science of immunotherapy and led to the founding of the New York Cancer Research Institute in 1953. The quotation in Latin is from Cicero's Defense of the Humanities. These studies nourish youth, enhance old age, deliver prosperity, and offer refuge and solace in adversity. Elizabeth, of course, would always cherish the memory of Bishop Coley, her father. She and the Coley family gave enthusiastic support to the Diocese of Central New York, which commissioned the bishop's portrait by Daniel Stone. In her final years at the Cathedral School of St. Mary, Elizabeth wrote plays for performance by elementary school students. One was called Back to the World, which she called her space farce or space skit. She meant outer space, of course, referring to the space age. She sent a copy of her skit to astronaut Alan Shepard, and he responded. And this letter you can see displayed outside. He wrote, quote, "Dear Mrs. Fox, thank you for your congratulations and thoughtfulness. The people of the United States, indeed the entire free world, are very happy and proud because of our successful space flight. Project Mercury is planning for more flights in the future. Let us hope that success follows success. Sincerely, Alan B. Shepard. P.S. We both enjoyed the space skit. Thank you." Elizabeth mailed a copy of the skit to First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy as well. This is Elizabeth's second grade class at the Cathedral School of St. Mary. Her simple method of remedial uplift and encouragement was embodied in a short manifesto that she titled, Think. She wrote, "Am I now, at this very moment of my life, thinking and feeling, doing or saying God's will for me, cooperating with the physical and spiritual laws of the universe, and so doing the best I can for myself and the world? In many years of remedial tutoring of down and out children given up by all other teachers, I have found an important element to be the power of positive thinking. In addition to encouraging pupils from the start on any small achievement they may make and building them upward from this, it is imperative to guide them psychologically in spiritually healing themselves." The Elizabeth Huntington Coley Fox papers are a marvelous addition to the library's archive. The broad themes inherent in this collection include the history of women in the family, the history of letter writing before telecommunications, the history of art and social life in New Rochelle, and the philosophy of religious belief. With this collection, my hope is that Elizabeth will remain in our memory to be recognized and studied and celebrated always. The original caption of this photo reads, "Lauren Gray and Pamela Hurst on their graduation day at the Cathedral School of St. Mary, Garden City, New York. With them is Mrs. Fox, who was their teacher in second grade, which she taught from 1951 to 1965, and was head of the primary school for 6 years. This photo certainly shows that she was a beloved and unforgettable teacher. Elizabeth was a descendant of Samuel Huntington, one of the founding fathers of the United States, a delegate to the Continental Congress and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He became president of the Continental Congress, Chief Justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court, and governor of Connecticut. Elizabeth was proud of her Huntington heritage and was actively involved in the Huntington Family Association. She was also a member of the Mayflower Society and the General Society of Mayflower Descendants. In 1920, at the age of 25, she attended the 300th anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth. And here she is visiting the Mayflower too in 1967. Elizabeth lived an exemplary life. She died on November 17, 1973. I have barely scratched the surface of her remarkable story, and perhaps this is the best summation of her philosophy. The good I meet with goodness. The bad I also meet with goodness. Thus, I obtain goodness because I make it real. The faithful I meet with faith. The faithless I also meet with faith. Thus, I obtain faith because I show that it is real. Before I conclude, I would like to give thanks to a few people. First and foremost, Susan Matrano, who donated the Elizabeth Huntington Coley Fox papers to the archive. Sue, would you please stand? Thank you. And thank you to your daughter, Sarah, as well. And to my friends and colleagues, Toby, Lisa, Ed, and Geraldo, without which I could not have done this program at all, or the exhibit that's outside, I give them a hearty handshake and great thanks as well. Finally, one last thing, a quote from Gilbert Chesterton. When we step into the family by the act of being born, we step into a world which is incalculable, into a world which has its own strange laws, into a world which could do without us, into a world which we have not made. In other words, when we step into the family, we step into a fairy tale. Thanks very much.